Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Lackawanna Pastimes. I'm Sarah Puccini, the Assistant Director at the Lackawanna Historical Society. Today we have a slightly Halloween-y themed program here for the end of October. I'll be looking at some true crime in northeastern Pennsylvania, starting in 1916, a rather long story that tells a great tale of murder and a jailbreak. We're joined today by Bill Salarday. Bill is a Scranton native, now living in Arizona. He fell in love with local history at West Scranton High School, inspired by his teacher, Nick Petula. His desire to determine the origin of his unique surname sparked a passion for genealogy. He has since traced his ancestors back to the Wyoming Valley Massacre. His father's service as a Scranton police officer instilled a deep respect for law enforcement. These three passions, Scranton history, genealogy, and law enforcement, inspired the creation of his True Crime NEPA blog, where he combines investigative and family history research to recreate historic crimes and tell the stories of those involved. He's resurrected dozens of cases dating back to the 1860s. When not writing about crimes, Bill likes to travel to sporting events. He documents his travels under the persona of the wandering spectator. So, Bill, I'll turn the program over to you to learn more about Dominic, Delfino, and the Great Escape.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to the Lackawanna Historical Society for having me, and most importantly, thanks to Nick Petula for number one, inspiring me many years ago in high school to learn about the history of Scranton. But then we just reconnected recently, and he saw some of my work and recommended that I present here today. So thank you, Mr. Petula and Lackawanna Historical Society for having me. So, as Sarah said, this is a wild story. I've been writing now for the past 5 years about some of Scranton's historical crimes, and when asked to come up with something to present here today, this is one of the stories that kind of jumped out to me. So we're going to get into it today. We're going to talk about Dominic Delfino, depending on tomato. And the Great Escape is the title that I called it, because it's kind of a wild ride, and it speaks, at the heart of it is really around Black Hand extortion techniques that were really prevalent in the early 1900s. A lot of my stories when I started writing involved a lot of the Black Hand, which was really just an extortion technique of Italian on Italian crime. Maybe the precursor, if you will, to modern day mafia, if you will. So this story's got it all, right? It's a story about murder and betrayal and a jailbreak and an international manhunt, and a 6-year man on the run, which is pretty crazy, for the time period. So let's jump in. It should be an interesting one for you. We'll set the stage. 1916. In Archbald at the time, it was an Italian immigrant community. A lot of Italians working there in the mines. And with the mines and blue collar work came alcohol consumption and some petty crime and things like that. And like I said, Black Hand was pretty big at the time. And what we know is Demetrio Morabito was drinking at Mello's Saloon down in Archbald, and he kind of made his way home after a night of drinking. He came up Main Street, turned down Wayne Street, got to the underpass, which is, they called the subway back then, got there, and just on the other side was ambushed, and a couple shots rang out. Demetrio fell to the ground. It was sort of near Main Street, so his rescuers kind of came to his aid. The shooter took off, and Demetrio was said to be saying, Dominic Delfino shot me. He shot me for no reason. And that kind of was the crime that starts the tale of Dominic and his great escape. So who was Demetrio? Demetrio was a 28-year-old immigrant from Moserofa, Italy, and that's down in Calabria, and what's called the toe of the boot. Here you'll see the image is kind of the Strait of Messina is in here. Sicily's over on the left, and Moserofa is over on the right. He arrived in 1905. He returned to Italy. He married his wife Carmela in Italy. They came back to the U.S. Eventually, they had a family of 4 before Demetrio was shot down and murdered. And so the scene, what we know, through the research, we find that Mello's Saloon was about here on Main Avenue. And that evening, April 16th, Demetrio left probably around 8:15, somewhere in that time frame, was walking up Main Street, made a right on Wayne Street, came under the underpass where he was then ambushed. You'll see over here, this is Chestnut Street. This is where he was headed, right? So I didn't have the exact address, but he lives somewhere here along Chestnut Street. So he was, essentially halfway home to safety when he was eventually shot down. His dying words about Dominic, Delfino, I'm going to call him Delfino because that's what I've been, it's the pronunciation that I've heard. So Dominic, he was also an immigrant from Calabria, from Catania. He arrived in 1912 with his cousin Santo, but Dominic was single. He was boarding in a home with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Platico. I pulled up Dominico Delfino's birth record here from Calabria. And again, the situation here was that, boy, he was the guy, and it was his victim called out his name when he was dying, in his dying words. And then again at the hospital, as Demetrio was dying, he again told investigators and doctors that Delfino was the shooter for no apparent reason. After the shooting, investigators were right on it. They found Dominic at a store owned by Tony Patilla on Main Street. They placed him under arrest immediately. Of course, he denied everything initially, but upon interrogation, police were asking him about the gash that he had on his face, and someone recalled that that this had happened before, and there was a mix-up with Morabito in the past. And so when that started to come out, Dominic changed his tune and he admitted to the killing. So there they've got their guy. He admits to the killing. But at the time, Delfino was saying, hey, he was a blackhander and he was extorting me. And, I ended up shooting him, but he's the bad guy in this whole thing. And the strange twist comes because both of these guys, Delfino and Morabito, were actually roommates for a couple of years prior, until Morabito kicked Delfino out because he was becoming too friendly with the police. And the word was that Delfino was actually working with Archibald Police Chief James McHale to try to clean up some of the blackhand. And so when Morabito heard about that, he basically kicked Delfino out. Back then, so the shooting takes place in April. An indictment came down after the investigation in September, and before you know it, the right to a speedy trial was definitely in play back in those days, right? So the indictment happens in September, the trial is set for November, and away we go. And this was, I'll call it a high-stakes trial because first-degree murder was the only charge on the table. It was either first-degree murder or acquittal, and the prosecution offered nothing in between, which was really strange of why they did that. The prosecution, they basically just said, look, he ambushed him, and it was Morabito's dying words, and there's nothing more than the declaration of a dying man that's proof of who the killer was. And then they had what was actually deemed a train of circumstantial evidence. One of the things that they had was the box of bullets that were found at Delfino's home matched the type of bullet that was in that basically killed Morabito. They had witnesses that placed Delfino in the area. They also testified that Delfino emptied his bank account. And in emptying his bank account, they claimed was, hey, he was getting ready to run. He cleaned out his bank account. He was getting ready to run. And then at the same time, they had the district attorney, George Maxey, who was really, he was a pretty ambitious DA. He was climbing the ladder. He was out in the public. He was, he was in the newspapers. And he wanted to, he was quoted as saying he wanted to end the rain of blood that's drenching Lackawanna County. And again, back at that time, writing these stories, I've got countless stories of, murder and violence, especially among the Italian community back then. So that was the kind of the case for the prosecution. Delfino, on the other hand, he hired a couple of attorneys, and they said, look, there were no eyewitnesses. They painted Morabito as the villain. He had a quote, what they called a troublesome disposition. And the biggest thing they tried to rely on was the timing that couldn't work, right? And so they did get, by the way, they did get Delfino to kind of rescind his admission of guilt. And then they said the timing of the murder couldn't work. They had witnesses placing him at Patia's store before and after the incident, and so they relied pretty heavily on that. What happens though is the jury, after hearing all of this, the jury, in a wild move, said they wanted to go walk the route themselves. They wanted to walk the route from Patia's store to the scene of the murder and back, and they wanted to find out like how far it was and how long would it take them, etc. So on the screen here, again, we've got Mello's Saloon here. Patia's store was right here around the corner on Wayne Street. And so when you Google map it out now, it says it was really about a 4-minute walk. And so a 4-minute walk to and from, that's 8 minutes alone just on the walk. And by the way, the investigation said when investigators caught Delfino back at Patia's store after the murder, he wasn't out of breath. He was just normal and like nothing had happened. So they don't believe he ran back from the scene. And again, the other interesting thing was the murder weapon was found sitting on a train on the tracks just a few feet away from the murder. And the investigators believe that the murderer actually put the gun on the train in hopes that the train would take off and the weapon would never be found. Unfortunately, they did find the murder weapon and the bullets that were in it, and then they matched them back to the casings that they had allegedly found at Delfino's apartment in his home. So pretty interesting. And so when it was all said and done, the jury kind of comes back and they deliberate over Thanksgiving. It was said to be kind of a wild, raucous deliberation. But within a couple of days, they come back with a guilty verdict. First degree, guilty of murder on December 1st, 1916. Away we go. And they recently introduced the electric chair. So it was going to be death via electric chair in Rockview Prison out in Center County in Bellefonte. So it's pretty crazy. Things happen. But then after that, really chaos ensued. A few things happened. Chief McHale of the Archbald Police, he was on Delfino's side. He was saying that he's innocent. He believes an innocent man is on the way to the electric chair. What he says is that D.A. Maxey, rather, at the time, D.A. Maxey coerced some of the witnesses to false testify. And he said some things about the cartridge box that was found. It wasn't found in Delfino's room. It was found in the rooming house, but not Delfino's room. So there were some inconsistencies there. The other thing that came to light was that Delfino was actually working with McHale basically on a sting operation. It came out later that Delfino met with McHale. Delfino was supposed to meet with Morabito that evening and other Blackhanders to join the Black Hand. Delfino was alleged to have $100. He met with, he was supposed to meet with McHale to mark the money. And then go into the meeting, and then McHale was going to bust the meeting and come out with the marked money to give back to Delfino. Unfortunately, when McHale was on his way to meet with Delfino at Patia's store, he noticed a couple of other kind of seedy characters walking down Main Street, and he followed them. So he got distracted. Walked away from Patia's, followed those guys, turned out to be nothing. When he was on his way back from Patia's, he heard the gunshots ring out. So now McHale is thinking, geez, here's a guy that I'm working with to try to put away some of these Blackhanders. And it turns out that, he's going to get the chair. In the meantime, Maxey is basically blaming McHale, saying, you took money from this guy and you extorted him to say you were going to try to defend him and get him off. And so this thing, went back and forth for a while. the kind of back and forth in the newspapers. There's a lot of yelling and screaming at each other and name calling and whatnot. The appeals go all the way up to the Supreme Court. While this is happening, Delfino is sitting in the Lackawanna County Jail, wondering about his fate. Um, and, and the interesting thing is, while he's in jail, he becomes a wizard at checkers. Um, and it's widely known now that nobody can beat Delfino in checkers, and they actually bring in other people. The warden, the guards bring in other people to play him checkers, between the bars, which is pretty amazing. But before long, Delfino tells other inmates, hey, they're going to write a new history about me. They're going to write a new story about me. And people didn't understand what that was all about until a day or two later, on February 4th, 1918, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Delfino makes a bold escape out of the prison. It's pretty crazy. So he starts off, he's in this cell number 301 in the corner of the jail on the first floor. This depiction, by the way, coming out of the Scranton Times, I thought was fantastic. I've never seen, in my research, anything like this. And I think it's really, really interesting illustration. But he saws his way out of the jail through what they said was an 8.5 by 11 opening. Don't ask me how he did that. What the newspaper said, sometimes the newspapers would exaggerate a little bit, but he sawed his way out of the jail cell. And then he makes his way down, and if you look closely here, he's got a big wooden stick in his hand, and that wooden stick was the leg of a rocking chair. It was sitting in a bucket of water that they use for cleaning supplies over here somewhere. And he picked up that stick and he runs towards the doorway, and he waits there, and he waits until Keeper Josephs enters the jail cell. And when he enters the jail cell, Delfino ends up clubbing Joseph, bludgeons him over the head, beats him up, and he's beating him on the ground. He's got him all bloodied, and then all of a sudden, Dominic pulls a gun on the keeper and says, "Give me the keys." So as he's trying to get the keys from Joseph's is saying, "I don't have the keys. I don't have the keys." Next thing you know, Delfino takes off. He runs up the stairs. He goes to the second floor, and he's making his way out to what they called the Diamond, out of this jail, out of this kind of holding area and into another area. And as he does, Joseph's is yelling to his other keeper, Proudlock, "Hey, we got an inmate loose." And Delfino's making the run. He gets over to the other end, and he runs into Proudlock. Is Robert Proudlock is the other keeper that he runs into. He basically has the gun in his hand. Delfino's got the gun in his hand, and he pushes Proudlock back. He kind of runs again. He's telling Proudlock he wants keys, but Proudlock says, "Hey, I don't have the keys. I don't have the keys." He runs into another keeper, Ike Steinberg, and now gets him to put his arms up. And now they're saying Delfino wants the keys. So Proudlock says he's got the keys. They're in his pocket, but he doesn't say that. He says, "The keys are in the desk. I got to go into the desk." And in the desk is where his gun is. So they run into the warden's office, into where the desk is. And when he opens up the desk, Proudlock starts to fire at Delfino, and then Delfino fires back. Delfino ends up striking the keeper a couple of times, and he falls down. Proudlock misses Delfino in the process. And so now Delfino runs and hides in another office, and he goes under the desk, and he's reloading his weapon. And as he's reloading the weapon, what happens is Proudlock then throws the gun to Joseph's. And when he throws I got to back up here, he throws the gun to Joseph's. And what happens next, Joseph's trains the gun onto Delfino and pulls the trigger and only gets a click. And next thing you know, Delfino basically says, "Now I've got you, you son of a bee," right? And then he starts firing back at Joseph's. Miraculously, Joseph's isn't hit. Delfino makes his way out of the prison, and at 3 o'clock in the morning on a cold, snowy night, Delfino's loose from the prison. Amazing escape. He's on the run. There's some things that happen outside. Some neighbors hear the gunshots. They call police to the scene. But basically, at this point, Delfino is off and running. Um, in the way Joseph's now was running after him to try to get him to stop, and he doesn't stop, and he's gone. At this point, Delfino kind of escapes into the night. Immediately, there's a $500 bounty, wanted dead or alive. You've all seen those old dead or alive posters from years gone by, but here's a legitimate one from 1918 in Scranton. Hard to believe, but there's the story of him. He's got a scar on his face. He had a black eye from playing ball in jail a few days ago, and he's now on the run. As it comes out, some of the initial investigation, they find out that tools were smuggled into the jail by, initially they said by nuns. That was later debunked. It was some family members that ended up being arrested, and for helping the escape. But again, those things kind of got pushed away, and charges never really got filed. The manhunt goes over a 100-mile radius. They're looking all over for him. And then they're thinking that maybe the guards, some of the guards were brand new, so they were thinking the guards helped him escape. They weren't really sure what was going on. And then another bit of information came that one of the inmates said that Delfino planned to, quote unquote, get D.A. Maxey for putting him away, and finding him guilty and sentencing him to death. So in that, a little over time, the reward goes up to $1,000, which, at that time was a lot of money. And there were sightings everywhere. There were all kinds of false reports coming in over the next, several months. Somebody saw him down in Palmerton. Someone saw him in Philadelphia. Someone saw him in New Jersey. They saw, they had train receipts that, that they believed he was going to Dover, New Jersey. It was a crazy, crazy investigation, but they couldn't find him. And so what later kind of came to be is they find out that, here's the jail. He escaped that night. All he had on was a light shirt, a light pair of pants, and socks. He didn't even have shoes on. And so he took off up Greenridge Street, makes his way over to Dunmore Corners, and gets his way over into Troop. And when he gets over into Troop Corners, he knocks on the door of a home, Thomas Price. Price, it's the middle of the night. Price doesn't let him in, so he goes next door to William Race's home, and they open the door, and they were chatting, and Mrs. Race, felt bad for him, so she ended up selling him a coat at least to put on. So he buys a coat from her. Then he goes, a couple houses away, and he goes to another home, Paul Mintick's home, and he tells Mintick, he wakes up Mintick, and he tells Mintick that he was in a cab and he was on his way, and the cab got hijacked and they stole $200 from him, but he begged to get $50 back. And so all he has to his name now is $50, and he just wants to buy some clothes. Again, Mintick doesn't sell him any clothes, but that becomes the kind of the story with Dominic. Dominic was what do I want to say? He was kind of a boisterous individual. He liked to tell tales, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll find out more as we go along. But as he kind of escapes there, he hits up a mine area, and he steals a couple of coats and some overalls from the mine. He dirties up his face with coal, finds a hat in the mines, throws that on, tries to basically disguise himself, make him look bigger than he is, makes him look like a miner. He shows up in Archbald, where he runs into his godfather. And the godfather, when he saw him, thought he saw a ghost, because he knew that he was in jail. So he was like, "What are you doing here?" Whatever. So the bottom line there is, in Archbald, he pulls together some people, and collects about $300 quickly, that basically aids him in his escape. And so after Archbald, he hops in a cab. I'm not sure if it was a horse-drawn or an actual car at that point. Both were in play. But he hops in a cab, and he wants to go to Carbondale. And actually, he wanted to go to Forest City. And so they made it to Archbald. They almost make it up to Forest City, but the snow was too deep up there. They had to turn around and come back to Carbondale. So he stays in Carbondale a couple of days. Next thing you know, he's on his way on a train to Oneonta, New York, where he ends up boarding with another Italian family. They take him in. He sits down. He's with this Italian family. There's another boarder there. The boarder pulls out a newspaper article and says, "Hey, check this out. There's a guy from Scranton that escaped from this jail. This guy's crazy. Look at what he's done." And Delfino says, "Boy, that sure is one smart fellow, that Delfino guy. Let's have a drink to Dominic Delfino." So they toast Dominic, and at that point, though, Dominic knows that, hey, the news is already up here. I got to get out. So the next thing you know, Dominic bails out. He takes a train to Albany. So he goes from Oneonta over here up to Albany, and then transfers and takes the train over, through Rochester and into Buffalo. Now, along the train, Dominic, again, disguised at this point. He dyed his hair. He had he got some ammonia and whatnot. He actually dyed his hair and his mustache to try to make him look different. On the train, the police don't even recognize him. Two police officers from Scranton apparently see him on the train, but they don't recognize him. They walk right past him. He's not worried about it. He doesn't even look the same. He stops off in Buffalo for a couple of days, spends the night in a nice hotel for a couple of days, kind of freshens up. Then he hops on a commercial train, a freight train, I should say. Gets the guy to allow him on the train for $10 to allow him passage into Canada, where he ends up in Toronto. Now he's working at a slaughterhouse in Toronto. Not sure on the time frame here, maybe a couple of months later. Two police officers come to the door where he's boarding. They say, "Hey, we're looking for Dominic Delfino." And so Dominic says, "Oh, I'll go get him for you. He's upstairs." And while he does that, he jumps out the side window of the house, escapes, and he's gone again. So away we go. He says, "I got to get out of here." And he says, "You know what? I've got to get further away." So he heads up to Sudbury, Ontario, way up north in northern Ontario. And he's working for the pulp and paper factory up there. It's a pretty big factory, gets work pretty easily. But one day he's walking along the tracks, and turns out he's stopped by mounted police, and they start to interrogate him. And he says, "Look, I'm an Italian, but man, I hate those Germans. I'll go to work. I'll go to war for Canada, and we'll fight those Germans." Canadians take a liking to him. They kind of release him, but he says, "Hey, before you let me go, I don't want to have to go through this again. Could you just write up a paper that you vetted me?" Sure enough, they do. The Mounties write up a paper, basically giving him a get out of jail free card that he uses now as he crosses Canada. So now he says, "I got to get out of Sudbury," and he heads up to Calgary. But he feels pretty confident now. There's no fingerprinting or anything like that that occurred back then. He's on his way to Calgary. But when he's in Calgary now, this is around February of 2019, so now maybe a year later after his escape, he's feeling pretty emboldened, and he makes a return to Scranton. There was a wedding that was happening. He was rumored to be attending a double wedding in Archbald, and he was staying at a home of Anthony DeFazio, allegedly in Archbald. So police raid the wedding, but they don't find anything. The police were also worried that he was now coming back to get D.A. Maxey, right? Because he had already said he was going to come back to get him. And Dominic actually said at one point that he did go back to Maxey's house. And this is Maxey's house at 901 Clay Avenue. And he said he camped out there, and he was going to try to attack and jump D.A. Maxey for giving him the electric chair. He later recants this story, so I'm not sure if it's real or not. But I thought that was a pretty interesting one for Dominic. But he doesn't stay in Scranton long. He's on the way again. This time he goes back up to Albany to meet with the Blackhanders that he again met with on the last stint that he was there. The Blackhanders there loved him. They wanted him to come back and be a part of the Blackhand there, but he didn't want to stay, in the States. He wanted to get back to Canada. But before he did, he ended up going back down to New Jersey. And it was rumored that he went to Dover initially. And so I think he went back down to Dover, met with some people there, got some more money, and then headed off back to Calgary. Pretty amazing though. He's got quite the run in Calgary. He stays there for a while. He becomes a rum runner while he's in Calgary, an alcohol guy, right? So next thing you know, he gets busted in Calgary. He had $13,000 in cash on him. They got all the alcohol. But they have no idea it's Dominic Delfino. He was running under multiple aliases. And so he got busted for that, but he eventually serves time and gets out of jail. He then ends up making his way over to Vancouver, Canada. So now he's all the way across Canada. And this is in 1920 now. He's meeting with a fellow Italian named Giuseppe Calderini in Vancouver. And they become pretty good friends. But once again, he kind of sticks and moves. He makes his way down to Seattle. In Seattle, this gregarious personality that he is, he buddies up with a lot of law enforcement, becomes friends with them. The old adage, keep your, friends close, but your enemies closer. So he buddies up with the police. It's pretty crazy, but, again, he sticks and moves and he makes his way across Washington into Spokane. And then he stops in Bonner Ferry, Idaho for a little bit before he plans to enter back into Canada. And what happens next is when he's entering Canada in October of 1923, he stopped because he doesn't have the right papers. And so he's fined $50 and he's sentenced to 60 days in jail. But again, he's not worried about it, right? He's got, a new identity. Nobody knows who he is. So he figures he just bide his time while he's in jail. So he's sitting in this jail in a mining town called Nelson, British Columbia. But while he's there, he writes to his friend, Giuseppe Calderini over in Vancouver, asking him for some money. And he also tells Calderini, he confides in him that he is who he is. He's Dominic Delfino, and he committed this crime. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but he confides in Calderini. Well, Calderini flips on him. He tells two of the detectives in Vancouver that are big against Black Hand activity. He tells these two gentlemen about it. They find out who it is. The one guy is actually Joe Ricci here on the left. They actually called him Camera Eye because he had a photographic memory. And so in Vancouver, he remembers meeting Delfino under a different alias. And so he ties the things together and says, that's our guy. We got to go get him. So Ricci and Sinclair make their way over to the Nelson jail, and they start pressing Delfino. And within minutes, he flips and says, yep, I'm the guy. I'm Dominic. I admit it. But initially, he waives his extradition only if he gets a new trial in Pennsylvania. But new trial is not granted. They're saying we're not going to do this. And eventually, he capitulates and says, fine, I'll go back to Scranton. So he tells everybody there that, hey, I was going to go to Mexico. Once I got out of this jail, I was going to Mexico. And he said to Sinclair and Ricci that he'd never go back to Scranton alive at one point. But he does. So he makes it back. And while Scranton sends a couple of guys to go get him, Daniel Williams from the DA's office, and then two detectives, Chris Rose and A.J. Riley, they make their way cross country to pick up Delfino. A few days to travel, to Vancouver, a few days to travel back. When the detectives get there, they were searching Delfino for any weapons, and they found packets of red pepper. And he had planned to use the red pepper to disorient the guards and try to, get them to temporarily blind them so he could take off. Interesting, if you look closely in the photo, you can actually see that he's got handcuffs on. He's actually handcuffed to Daniel Rose here. I thought that was a pretty interesting picture. And then, so he's back. He basically now says it was self-defense. So for the first time, we hear Dominic say it was self-defense. Why he didn't claim self-defense earlier is anyone's guess. We think that McHale said, look, just deny, deny, deny. I can get you off. I can get you off. As opposed to even saying if it were self-defense, he would have got manslaughter and a couple of years in prison. I believe that McHale was saying, I got you. I can get you off. And so that's what ended up happening. Now he's facing death, and now he's starting to realize I should have claimed self-defense. McHale kind of, left me out to dry, and away we go. So he recants a few things. I think at that point he recants that the nuns, it wasn't nuns, it was, some relatives that helped him out. He embellished his escapes. He was telling people that he could shoot bottle caps out of the air, crazy stuff. But he's back in jail. He runs through all the final appeals. They try a couple more things. He says, "Hey, while I was in Canada, I was actually I helped rescue a drowning woman from the river. Like, would someone with a bad heart do that?" So he tried to appeal that way. He tried to. Two women came forward and said, "Hey, there was a deathbed confession from Tony Cotronelli. He died a few years ago, and on his deathbed, he professed that he was the murderer, and he brought these two women to his bedside while he was dying and said, I was the one that killed Morabito, and that if Delfino is ever captured, please bring this information to light, that he wanted to, be the one that was responsible." Well, turns out that was discredited because the witnesses were tied to Delfino's allies. They kind of knew that it was, all of allies, and it was all just kind of a made up lie. Again, everything's denied. The appeals are denied. Delfino again confesses, and he just begs for mercy at that point. In March of 24, he's headed for Rockview. Finally, they're on a train to Rockview. On the train, he's heard singing the song "Paddle Your Own Canoe," and if you read the words there, I've traveled about a bit of my time, and troubles I've seen a few. I found it better in every climb to paddle my own canoe. And what he was referring to is McHale kind of turned on him, and Cotronelli, the guy in Vancouver, turned on him. And so he just felt like I should have just been more responsible for my own actions. I relied on others. I should have paddled my own canoe. So I thought that was interesting. On the train, there was a waiter on the train, and the waiter had made some comments to him or whatever. And Dominic turned to him and said, "Hey, do you want to trade places?" And of course, the guy said, "No, I don't want to trade places." And Dominic famously said, "Why is it that everybody's that is told that heaven is the greatest place to go, yet no one wants to go there?" Pretty wild words from a guy headed for execution. He becomes tearful about his parents when talking about his parents. He's very sad. He used to send money back to his parents all the time. He tells his guards to basically, "Hey, you got to tell my brother to get back to Italy, leave, the United States, get back to Italy, take care of my mother and father, never leave their side." So that's kind of what was happening and running through his mind on the train. When they get there, he calls for Father Clement Cavaletti. They say a few prayers, and at March 10th at 1924, 7:05 a.m., he's saying his prayers, and then minutes later, he's shocked with 2,000-volt shocks. Two doctors come in, they pronounce him dead at 7:11 a.m. They turn, and that basically it's the end of the story, right? He becomes the second Lackawanna County man executed since 1915 when Frank Palma was executed. Afterwards, some fallout occurs, right? So a few things happen, right? Carmela, his wife, devastation kind of continues. The good news is that Maxie actually collected money from the community to give to Carmela, to try to help meet, help ends meet. McHale leaves the police department, becomes a private detective, but then loses that license. Maxie became a chief justice, and pulled the license from McHale because he believed it was alleged that he was extorting clients in the alcohol business. So that was an interesting twist. As I said, Maxey did go to become the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, which is pretty amazing, from the DA of Scranton. He ends up dying years later in his Pittsburgh office. Dominic is buried in the Einan Cemetery. His procession was huge. They had 25 cars in the procession. So clearly he was a well-liked man in the community. And then Calderini, the guy that turned on him in Vancouver, is ostracized by the Italians. They couldn't believe that a countryman turned him in. And the kind of black hand continues to linger throughout the area. And then Joe Ritchie here, the guy, he looks like quite the character. He actually won the lottery. Both him and his wife had won the lottery in Canada. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So at the end, this piece I pulled from the newspaper, and it said, "The law is patient, it is tireless, and it has a long arm." That was shown in the case in Dominic Delfino escaped from Lackawanna County Jail 5 years ago after being condemned to the electric chair. Right, so 5 years go past, and they still find their man, and they sentence him, and he dies in the electric chair. So this leaves you with, right? Was it self-defense? Was it out and out murder? I don't know, right? But my research suggests that it was really self-defense against black hand extortion. So my belief is that Dominic was being extorted. He had had enough. There were other pieces. His home had burned down mysteriously. He had gotten slashed, right? So there were some things in there that I think Dominic had enough, and he fired back at the Black Hand. I do believe that McHale's betrayal sealed his fate. He got really bad advice from James McHale. And the interesting thing was that Delfino actually dreamed that one day when he was on that train, he told his guards that, one day this, my story should be a movie. And if that happens, we'd all be rich. And I look at this and go, I think there's no better story. I think it's a fantastic story from the early 1900s. Pretty amazing story. It's sad about the Morabito family, what had occurred there. But it was a sign of the times in crazy Italian communities in the early 1900s. So that is it for me. I'll leave it with any questions that anybody has. I appreciate it again for your attention and your attendance today. So thanks for having me again. Are there any questions?
I have a question. Very interesting. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation as well. But the first thing that came to my mind was, after all of this, it was early 1900s, and I think fingerprinting was around. Why was there never any fingerprinting done on the gun?
I don't know when fingerprints came out, but the articles that I was reading, and I have that in other articles, and I can't think off the top of my head, but in this specific case, there were no fingerprints available for this specific case. I don't know if anybody can speak on to when the fingerprints came out, but they didn't have any in this case.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm not sure exactly when fingerprinting started. I have thousands and thousands of mugshots. Most of them used the Bertillon method well into the World War I era. The ones from the 1920s, beginning from the 1920s and 30s, they all have fingerprints on the back, but nothing earlier. So that would require a little research. But apparently it wasn't a common practice in the World War I era to fingerprint, at least on the records that I have. I'd also like to comment what a great job Bill did. I'm so proud of him. It's nice to see a former student being successful. And it was a great presentation. And I concur. It would make a great movie. And Bill could maybe be a producer or an executive producer. And we could contact some great Italian star.
Exactly.
Thank you again,
I
Bill. It was
appreciate
great.
it. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for the kind words again. Thanks for the inspiration back in the 1980s. Appreciate it.
I've got a question. Nick, I attended your last talk at the Historical Society. Do I recall that you knew some Black Hand members over there on Court Street?
I'm going to take the no
fifth?
comment that they use in British law.
Plead the fifth.
There were rumors of many of the old men in the neighborhood, people that had slashing scars, nothing precise. In my book, I mentioned my great uncle, who apparently was an associate. Whether he was a true member or an associated member, I don't know, but he certainly had a checkered past. And the more I look into it, the more I find out that he wasn't the kind of loving old man that I thought he was. But by the time I was growing up and aware of things in the 1950s, many of these were people had passed on. And a lot of, even when I was writing my book in the 1990s on the neighborhood, and I had touched on the Black Hand, I really didn't appreciate how significantly involved crime was, not just in my neighborhood, but throughout the region. The Black Hand was unbelievably powerful, but they were also unbelievably secretive. And even in the 1990s, when I was talking to different people about interviewing some of the older people, they did not want to talk about it even then, even though most of the people had been that I was asking about were long dead or very, very, very old men. That fear was still there. So it's amazing to think that if we could put ourselves into the place of the people that lived at the turn of the century and into the 1920s, the effect that the Black Hand had on these people. They were very violent. They were extremely cruel. They picked mostly on their own countrymen. They didn't go outside of their own neighborhoods with their influence. But it really is shocking to think that they could be so notoriously involved in so many different criminal activities. I found out an awful lot just in my own neighborhood, dozens and dozens and dozens of murders. And then Bill sent me more material, which I wish I had back in the 1990s, of even more crimes, more murders. It would take many more years of research to fill in some of the gaps, but it was so widespread that it's amazing that they got away with so much for so long.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I it's interesting when I look at the Black Hand, Nick. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I look at this and it was more a technique, right? It was I looked at it as an extortion technique, more so than the mafia per se. But at the same time, there was this secret society of the Black Hand. You were either in it or you weren't in it. And then those Black Handers were extorting the money. So it was more maybe it was the combination that the society existed, and then they were typically going after the more wealthy people that had money. But they would also go after somebody that had a job, and they would just try to get, little bits of money from everybody. So I know there was an ongoing debate whether the Black Hand was actually an organization or whether it was just an extortion technique. And I kind of blend the two of them. It's pretty interesting. I also did check, by the way, one of the other articles that I wrote in 1910 talks about fingerprinting was a relatively new thing in 1910. So to your point, Christine, I think that, it came out around 1910, somewhere in that period, but it was new. And as Nick said, it wasn't really used on every case at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also have an article on fingerprints. Apparently, it goes back to ancient Egypt. They had some kind of system. However, the first systematic use of fingerprinting in the United States was implemented by Dr. DeForest, who I think also had something to do with television later on. And his system would prevent fraud in New York's civil service. In 1903, New York state prisons started using fingerprints to identify people released into custody. But it wasn't until 1924 that the FBI established its identification division, and they started creating a national repository for fingerprint records. So that would have been very new at the time all of this was going on.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I'd encourage you, my website is listed on the page. It's truecrimenepa.wordpress.com. For more stories. There's dozens of stories out there. I write them, whenever I get the kind of the inkling. I will say I started writing a couple that were a little closer, a little maybe in the 70s. And when I wrote one story that hit a little too close to home to somebody, and my wife encouraged me to go back further. So that's why I started writing about crimes from the 1860s all the way through maybe I try to stay around maybe the 1940s, somewhere in there. I try not to come too far, beyond that, right? I want to get generations removed from any of this. But I also say too, look, I do a lot of genealogy, and you uncover some crazy things when you're doing genealogy. And I always tell people, your ancestors' past doesn't dictate your future. So no matter what happened back then, you can't change it. It is who, it made you who you are today. Just embrace it and know that that's what it is, right? And move on from it. You can't be ashamed of it. It's just the way things were back then. So the only way that we can change things going forward is to know what they were and improve, upon from the past. So that's kind of my thing. And when this particular story, when I was researching it, I actually did find some descendants of Carmela, and that. I asked that person, do you mind if I write this story? And they said, by all means, please do. We know about it. We knew about some of the details, and they were interested in finding what I would uncover. And so since then, they've been very appreciative of, being able to tell the story, the unfortunate story of, Morabito's death. But I also said, hey, I hate to say this, but I also think that Morabito was the blackhander. And Delfino was, just defending his turf, and he was ended up putting to death. So anyway, that's kind of that's what happens with these things. So it's your heritage, it's your history. Embrace it, know it, love it, but move on from it. So that's it.
Okay, thank you again, Bill, for joining us to share that completely wild story that reminds us again that Scranton in its heyday was a lot like the Wild West. We love a good story that we find in the archives as we're going. So thanks again for joining us and for sharing your research. Our next program for Lackawanna Pastimes will be the third Friday before Thanksgiving. I'll be joined by Dr. Louis Esposito, a researcher who's been working on the NEPA Language and Life Project over the summer. Interviewed dozens of local residents looking for information about the local dialect and customs. So if you've ever said Hena or asked for a couple two treat of something, this is the program for you. That'll be again November 21st, our next episode of Lackawanna Pastimes. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great weekend.